The environment is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces.
We're talking in Chapter 5 about the lines of approach and action. That means what should we do? Now that means both individually and in community, which could be local, or it could be regional, national, it could be international. Look at the way the Pope starts. The dialogue, he talks about 5 different areas of dialogue in this chapter, but the first one is in the international community. What that is emphasizing is that environment, no matter how much we think that we can do locally in recycling and so forth, it depends to a great degree on what the international community does. And a lot of us are not in favor of that. And that's why, or at least the power of it over the local. And that's why this chapter is more problematic for a lot of people than almost any other that we have. The dialogue on the environment in the international community means that solutions have got to be made, and unilateral, that is when it's done by one country alone or in some way, that's not sufficient. We can do certain things. We can diversify our agriculture, our renewable energy and efficiency can all be done at these local, regional, national levels, but in the whole of things, the international community determines what has to be done to save the earth. And that's why there has been, since the very beginning of the environmental movement, way back in the 1970s, there was a Stockholm Conference, 1972, that brought people together. And that point was beginning to be known even then. And greater emphasis has been given down through the years. And so we had 20 years after that conference in Stockholm, Sweden, there was one in Rio, in Brazil, and that summit says that polluters have to pay the cost. Now there is where the international community has great difficulties. Some countries were the ones that started the whole of development and consumer goods being used in large amounts, and therefore they were the greater ones to blame for the rise to what is now over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And this really has happened in part because about 20% of the world's people were consuming much of the world's goods. And so as we move on, we say, okay, Rio says that consumers, the ones that are the polluters, must pay, but there is a lack of political will to talk about and do it. Now, the conference that is coming up when this was being developed is the one that is occurring in Paris, and we are all anxious to see how results from that will actually be implemented through a political will to do so. The Pope brings up several conferences that have been successful. There's been the Basel Convention on Hazardous Materials, and in many ways that has controlled the international trade of that, especially with waste materials being sent from one part of the world to the other. So far, and so there is also another, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And of course, it has not been fully implemented, as we were talking about ivory and use of horns of rhinos and so forth, but it is beginning to be, to a great degree. And so these things are occurring. But one of the better conferences has been that of the Vienna Convention to protect against protect the ozone layer. And that one was then followed up by a Montreal Protocol, which actually is the implementation of it. And to a great degree, this has been approved to such a degree that we do not have those types of materials that cause the harm to be still manufactured and used to any great degree. It's not easy, what we're talking about, but it is interesting that he begins at the international level, because we have to be, in some sense, we are dependent on whether we as people of the world are willing to take on these issues beyond national types of interest. Is it the whole people the common good that's involved. Global regulatory norms prevent waste dumping. They protect the oceans, and the oceans, 80% of our Earth's surface, that's a commons. That's what the Pope calls the global commons. And that can be damaged so easily by misuse. And so therefore, it is important for us to consider the commons that we have, parts of the poles and the other areas of the world, the surface areas, so much of it is common. And therefore, we should have a connection of peoples from various countries as nations working together to come to solutions which can be implemented and people held into sort of accountability on doing so properly. So then we move on, and he adds that a weakening of the national states because of economic and financial sectors have being transnational. That is, that there's international groups, really corporations, which go beyond the boundaries of countries. They tend to prevail over the political situations in some of these countries, mainly because some corporations are so big that they can overwhelm even the power of small national states. And so we understand that then this becomes a great challenge. But we move on then to the dialogue on the national and the local levels. And there's a whole mass of anti-pollution laws that we have to bring into effect. And these, of course, take enormous amounts of effort. And there are a lot of organizations that are environmental that are working on these. And so nation building is a difficult part of the world in which we live, and yet it is important that all of our nations become aware of what this global problem is and cooperate in the best way possible. There are, in the local areas, there are also co-ops that are trying to answer this in a different fashion, and the Pope mentions those, that they have a sense of responsibility. That means that we are all part of a global network, but still we work at the local levels to have a sustainable system. He mentions there that the system on an international basis is, strictly speaking, not sustainable. Therefore, what these small groups do that set up cooperatives, or there are non-government organization groups that are working for nonprofit areas, that these should be praised and should be supported to a great degree. He moves on from the national and the local levels to talk about a dialogue and transparency in decision making. And this is because, well, if you have a number of people interested in a certain issue, development, clear cutting or something, sometimes the poor have no voice, or very little voice. Decision is made from a distance. And he constantly says that these are areas in all business ventures that must be transparent, not just something that is added on, the environmental question. It is something from the beginning that has to be there. He makes a big issue of assessment processes being interdisciplinary, transparent, and free of economic and political pressure. That means that in being interdisciplinary, other voices have a right to be heard and have a balance to give to the whole situation. And he mentions that the Rio conference that we mentioned earlier said that there was a lack of full scientific certitude, that we understand that that lack of certitude should not be used as a pretext for postponing cost-effective measures. We're finding this in global change, that not all of the information is in yet, but does it all have to be in before we can make some prudential acts concerning it. Profit is not the sole criteria. Now, actually, almost anybody in this country would say that and agree, maybe, but in the heart of things, well, profits mean a lot, and they are a major decision maker. And he's saying we have to be honest, we have to have open dialogue and debate, and that we should not ever prejudice the common good for all. And so then we get into the politics and economy and dialogue. All these areas, as I said, are areas that we are to be in dialogue with. We should be talking to each other about them. transparency means that we have to assess in an interdisciplinary way the various problems that are associated with climate change, with all environmental issues, safety of children, health safety issues. They a lot of times are very important in this area. We have to weigh risk and benefits. We must remember that noise, we brought that up several times, visibility, cultural values, we brought up in Chapter 3, nuclear energy dangers, we brought it up several times, but it is again brought up by the Pope himself that these are areas that we need to have some type of decision making on the part of all the people, not just a few. Rio said, the lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a pretext for postponing cost-effective measures. Profit is not the sole criterion to be taken into consideration. We actually can quote from the Pope, but the response to the crisis, that is the crisis of 2008, 7 and 8, where banks failed and so forth, that we all remember so well, the Great Recession, the response to this crisis did not include rethinking the outdated criteria which continue to rule the world. We have to rethink what we're doing. If the areas are unsustainable, we've got to in some way challenge this lack of sustainability, because we've got to get the world back to where a balance is in effect, and we need to do it. He is saying, and this is why this chapter is so difficult, and people will overlook it sometimes, but he is saying that we've got to take it by the head and really look closely at what we've got and make new decisions. We have to be people who are willing to be discerning people who can assess what has to be done before it has caused the damage. But if it is already causing damage, all the more that we have to assess this and then look at the benefits and risk involved. And he brings up the fact that honest and open debate never prejudices the common good. Honest always and open debate always helps us to grow in that common good. And today it's being so utterly threatened by so much about us. And so the financial crisis has come, and it is with us. And at the same time, we know that it constantly calls for progress, and progress generally means a material form of progress. And what the Pope is saying, that is not the only way. The diversified and innovative forms of production, that is new forms, more appropriate technology type forms, which can impact less on the environment, can prove to be very profitable, beneficial to the very people who make up our world. And so the quality of life does not depend on constant consumption and overuse of resources, but rather slowing it up, accepting, as he says, decreased growth in some parts of the world provides resources for other parts for healthy growth. Of course, we have to have growth in areas where people have not yet had the total essentials of life. But we cannot allow luxury and excessive amounts being used by some to be to the detriment of the poor. Growth is necessary, but also a form of growth is a growth, interior growth, which does not necessarily mean that we have to increase production of cars or other areas that we have that actually use up a lot of our resources. And so he brings that point up, and that's where it is difficult. That is the great difficulty of this encyclical. And so people should dwell on it, not pass over it. Section 4 of that chapter 5. And he ends up talking about religions and dialogue with science, and he says that it would be incomplete for us to think that only the scientific answers, empirical scientific answers, will actually solve environmental problems. We have to also think about the sensibility of people, the ultimate meaning of life, the quality that people will have by not using too much. And in general, it's telling us that we've got to have all disciplines at work together and all peoples involved in coming to answers. Believers must live their faith, not contradict it in actions, he says, and we know that, but believers have a deeper meaning. We have to believe in the future, and therefore some of the actions that are unsustainable have got to stop. We have to modify them. We have to change the area of growth so that all peoples can benefit. It is for the benefit of all. Gravity of the environmental crisis, he says, demands a look always to the common good.